On the approval of the minutes, because we are remote, we're going to have to take a roll call vote. So approval of the minutes, Karen Gardner.
Aye.
Sean Gonzalez is not with us yet. Lisa Guyon.
Yes.
Wendy is not with us yet. Kristen O'Malley.
Aye.
Dorothy Savarese.
Aye.
Dan Wolf.
Aye.
Okay, the minutes have been approved. Next item on the agenda is a discussion of an open meeting law complaint that's been filed by Mr. Ron Beatty. And we have with us today online Michelle Randazzo from KP Law. And I think we have a copy, you have received electronically a copy of the proposed response to that complaint. So we will have to take a vote to authorize the sending of that. But I'm going to turn it over right now to Michelle, so maybe she can sort of step through that and she'll be available for any questions. So go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, thank you. So as you folks are a new committee and this is your first open meeting law complaint, I'll take 2 seconds just to explain the process. When an individual files an open meeting law complaint against a public body, it goes to the public body first for purposes of responding in writing. And that is what we're talking about today. If the complainant is dissatisfied with the response, they have the option to pursue it further to the Attorney General's office. But this is, as I said, the first step in the process. Yeah. And this particular complaint, as you've seen, raises 2 allegations of open meeting law violation. One is that the agenda for the committee's April 21st meeting was not posted timely. And the other is a more technical violation that the agenda that was posted didn't have a timestamp of the date and time it was posted. And, you know, my usual approach to these things is to gather the background facts and put together this draft response that you folks could review and see if it aligns with your understandings. And in my process of preparing this response, we found that the agenda had been posted timely. We were able to retrieve from IT some documentation to prove that fact. But it was, you know, a technical inadvertent oversight that the date and time stamp wasn't put on this agenda at the time it was posted. It has been on other meeting agendas. And so it really was just as I said, a technical inadvertent oversight. To the extent that the website gets changed and updated, there are ways that we can address that moving forward. But I know in talking with staff that they are, you know, going to be particularly attentive to this issue going forward to ensure that that type of inadvertent oversight doesn't occur. So really, you know, I've just summarized, you know, 4 or 5 pages of the response, but that's the gist of it. Our records reflect that the meeting was timely posted. But that we do acknowledge that the date and time stamp was omitted from it. Any questions? It's not rocket science.
Are there any questions from the committee? Okay, well, seeing none, we will take a vote based on, well, someone needs to make a motion and a second on the draft complaint. And a motion to, does it move forward to the county commissioners next?
No. So if I might suggest the motion to adopt the response and authorize me to send it on the committee's behalf.
Okay, so looking for a motion that the committee adopt the response prepared by council to the open meeting law complaint and authorize council to send it on the committee's behalf. Would someone make that motion?
So moved. Third attempt.
So moved. Seconded. Dan seconds it again. So having been motioned and seconded, we'll take a roll call vote on that motion. Karen Gardner.
Aye.
Sean is not with us yet. Lisa Guyon.
Aye.
Kristen O'Malley.
Aye. Aye. Hear me?
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Chris. Dorothy Savarese.
Aye.
Dan Wolf.
Aye.
Motion passes. We will send that along, and we thank you for your for being with us this morning, Michelle.
No worries.
And, you know, as always, we appreciate members of the public that log into the meeting and watch what's going on. And you know, the goal of the committee is to be transparent, so we appreciate any help in doing that. So thank you.
Thank you, folks. Have a good rest of your meeting.
Okay, on to the next item on the agenda. So this is an introduction of Clifton, Larson, and Allen. And these are the consultants, folks that are working with the county on the portal, and also on questions about what is or is not fundable under ARPA. So we're going to have a discussion this morning. I think that is specific to the use of ARPA funds for revolving loan funds. But any additional questions, I think we can field at the end. So I will turn that over at this point.
Shall I just set the
Vera,
chair?
please.
So we have in past advisory committee meetings, we've had suggestions and some discussion about the use of our county ARPA funds to fund revolving loan funds such that those funds can be useful in perpetuity for county priorities and projects of regional impact. However, we've received advice from our consultants at Clifton, Larson, Allen. The shorthand is CLA, suggesting that yes, while that is possible, it's not perhaps not the most effective use of the funds, and the funds can't be used sort of dollar for dollar in the way that we are thinking. What I did was I circulated just a briefing memo to you all that encapsulates some of the information Hannah York, who's with us this morning, sent to me in answer to this question. Much of this is taken directly from Hannah's commentary, as is the example that she provides. Hannah, if I could ask you just to sort of summarize why revolving loan funds, although seemingly the obvious thing to do, are not, maybe perhaps not why, but that the ARPA legislation does not allow for them to be used for revolving loan funds in their entirety.
Yeah, so let me just give you a little bit of background on it. You know, with the intent of the
Hannah, are you with us?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, there you are. You're still muted.
There.
I took off mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so let me just give you a brief background with the ARPA too. The intent of the ARPA grant program is to, you know, urgently assist communities in getting out of the ARPA pandemic with financial issues, okay? So they want you to spend the funds now, which is why some of the disallowed type of expenditures are, you know, you're not allowed to use it for a trust fund or for reserve funds, debt service, things like that, that aren't for current expenditures. Now, they did allow you to use it for loan programs. However, only the current cost of the loan program. Where that gets really complicated with these revolving loans is that if you're going to do a loan, and I put the summarized data and the exact verbiage right out of the final rule, the Treasury's final rule, and out of the some of the FAQ questions that they post. If you're doing a loan program and the entire loan will be paid back prior to the December 31st, 2024, which is the last day to obligate funds against ARPA. If the funds come back in, then you can use the whole amount against that. But then when they come back in, you have to re-spend them on something allowable within ARPA. So say you had a 1-year loan, you could use these basically as a cash flow, but then when the money came back, you'd have to re-spend it for an eligible purpose. From my understanding from Vera is that the program you'd be looking for on here would not qualify for that because the funds would be being paid back after that cutoff date. And after that date, you can't re-obligate any of those funds for a new purpose. And so what the Treasury says then, okay, if you're not going to receive the funds back by that cutoff date, then you can only charge the cost of loaning the funds out, that the time value of money in essence, the actual cost of making that loan, only that piece of it can be charged against ARPA. The principal, the amount that you basically have available to then turn around and loan out again, can't go against ARPA. So it's a complicated formula. I tried to put a more very simplified version together just as an example to show you, but in essence, You have to do a fair value, a present value calculation, assuming imputed interest, some items like this, to figure out what that current cost is, and would only be a portion of the total loan. So in other words, if you're going to loan out $200,000, only 40,000 of that and change could go against the ARPA grant. The remainder would have to come from county funds. And so that obviously I think would create a difficulty, because I think your assumption was the entire amount could come from ARPA. And it gets back to that intent of they want this money to be spent during this period, during the eligible use period, as opposed to being like a perpetuity type program.
Oh, we've got a couple of questions.
Okay, well, Dan, I see you have a question.
Yeah, can I just, instead of trying to explain the concept, I just want to give a hypothetical, okay?
Yep.
Let's say we have a middle-class person on the Cape, teacher, public safety official, whatever, the people that we've been talking about relative to housing, needs to buy a home. There's a home on the market for $600,000. And let's say out of the revolving fund, I'm not even going to call it a loan right now, we subsidize the down payment with $200,000, meaning that the person trying to buy the home now has a $400,000 nut instead of a $600,000. The point the only way I think this works is not to indenture that person with more. It's to take an equity position in the home of $200,000, such when the person sells the home, $200,000 would go back into the revolving fund. Any additional appreciation they would get the benefit of. And that's how I envision it, rather than a much more traditional loan. So I call that a revolving fund because actually I'm not sure that whether the $200,000 even needs to accrue interest. It's just, it revolves money in and out of the fund, subsidizing the down payment to make the home actually affordable to the people that we want to live in it. So I don't know, hypothetically, I don't want to get hung up on semantics, but I think that's how I would envision this, because it's sort of like, I'm not interested in coming up with schemes that just heap more debt. It's sort of like, let's make a 75-year mortgage and allow the house affordable. I mean, I'm not interested in stuff like that. I'm interested in actually subsidizing the people who we want to subsidize so that they can afford to live here without indenturing them. So conceptually, is that?
Yeah, that won't work.
Okay. And it doesn't work
So
because.
While it might seem like a great idea, it doesn't fall within the parameters of what's allowable with the ARPA funds.
Because it's not getting paid back within.
Because it's not being paid back within that time period, and whether or not you choose to charge an interest, you are required to assume an imputed interest. So say you do a 0% loan, that doesn't mean you then say, well, there is no cost of this. There's an assumed, so you have to go look in the market. And this is
But
where
I'm not calling it a loan. I'm calling it a subsidy and an equity position on that property.
Well, I get that, but if they have at any point in time a requirement to give you back money, no matter when that time is, it's still not a free and clear grant. Your other option is to just give people a grant, which is what I had recommended to Vera. You do a grant program, they have no obligation to pay you back at any time. So that's a different program. The other thing that I would just caution about that, though, and we have to make sure even with the grant program, there are certain restrictions on, you need to have a program set up that looks at a needs-based application process and all that, and make sure that that qualifies within the ARPA program. And I will tell you, middle class is going to be a hard sell for that. It's going to be more to qualify within the ARPA program. It's going to need to be more on the lower end.
Hey, Hannah, I'm just going to say this, and I promise I'll shut up. If we're using as housing a 30% of income, I don't care whether we designate that as a little middle class, upper class, lower class, or no class. You can devise a metric by which you would say that home is only affordable to that family if their contribution on a monthly basis, whether it's a rent or a mortgage, is not more than 30% of their income when they actually do the transaction. That's how I would view this. So there are mechanisms we could set up that actually address the feasibility and viability of either renting or ownership with this fund. And the one thing I don't like about grants is you deplete it. I mean, I think what
Right.
we're trying to do is set up some kind of mechanism that actually is self-perpetuating. So now, as I promised, I will shut up.
Wait, and I completely understand. It's just ARPA's not the mechanism to make that happen because it's just not allowable within the eligible use of the program.
Okay, are there any additional questions? Seeing none, I think we can move on. So thank you, Hannah, for that response.
Thank you.
So revolving loan funds doesn't seem to be advisable, to say the least. So it makes our job a little bit more difficult in trying to figure some of these things out, but not impossible. So we will move on to the next item on the agenda, which is discussion of criteria, regional challenges, outcomes, and the ranking of regional challenges. So we have spent some time. The last meeting, it got a little bit confused. I think we need some visual aids to sort of step through some of this. So I have a PowerPoint presentation, just like 8 slides that we can run through that are just my suggestions on how to sort of organize our thoughts and move forward in the ranking process, and then a suggestion about the schedule for these meetings coming up over the next couple of weeks. And then Vera also has which was mailed out to you, a spreadsheet that sort of outlines some of the potential thoughts on sort of project evaluation metrics. So can we do the PowerPoint? Awesome. And a lot of this will cover ground that I think I at least tried to cover last week, but hopefully this will be a little bit more straightforward. So starting with the ARPA federal project expenditure categories that we discussed, there are 7 of them, but they're public health, negative economic impact, services to disproportionately impacted communities, and infrastructure, as well as premium pay, administrative costs, and the provision of government services. So it's not the purview of this committee to consider the last 3 categories. We're really going to focus on the first 4 categories. And given the direction that we've received from the commissioners, we need to sort of focus on these expenditure categories so that what we spend the money on, what the money is spent on, is an allowable use. But we're going to do it in terms of regional challenges. So if we can move to the next slide. So the regional challenges that have been identified for our consideration are housing, water quality, childcare, infrastructure, climate, and economic stability. So by focusing on these regional challenges, discussing approaches and how we might prioritize these challenges regionally, I think we will start to make good on our charge and be able to and be responsive to the commissioner's request. So the next slide just briefly shows how those regional challenges can nest pretty easily within the 4 federal categories that we are going to address, so that the regional challenges and the federal expenditure categories are easily aligned, and that's good for us. So we'll focus on the regional challenges. Next slide. So outcomes, and I do think it's good to sort of refresh this and sort of lead with outcomes at every meeting so that we can stay focused. And these outcomes are really sort of drawn from the specific text that the commissioners have forwarded to us. So obviously the major outcome of this committee will be to make recommendations to the commissioners. But it doesn't have to be one report. Those recommendations could be iterative. If we get to a point where we think we can make a decision and we want the commissioners to sort of consider it for action immediately, we can do that in part. Clearly, the mission states that we have to prioritize issue areas. So the prioritization of those regional challenges is one of the outcomes. The other thing that they talk about is a criteria for evaluation. So coming up with a criteria to evaluate projects, which I believe anticipates that the portal will be open at some, or could be open to accept applications, grant applications from any groups we identify that we would want that to happen to. But so that kind of more straightforward grant program is part of the mission. But another part of the charge is the next sort of outcome identified by bullets there, which is to identify and describe potential projects of regional benefit. So it's kind of two different things. You know, looking at these projects of regional benefits, if we were just to open the portal to grant requests, it's unlikely that we would receive any projects that reach this level of sort of regional benefit and transformational, because there really aren't organizations other than the county itself that would consider projects of that sort of size and scope. So the other issue that we've been charged with is collating and summarizing potential sources of funding. So we've been working with Civilytics on that. We had our first presentation on the federal funds at the last meeting. Unfortunately, Jared's father passed away unexpectedly, and he was not able to join us today to move forward on the state evaluation piece of that, but he will be with us again in 2 weeks. So the collation and summarization of potential sources of funding is important. I think that's a really important context when we get there for the commissioners to consider how they want to spend the money in. And the final one that's identified in that written mission statement is the identifying types of subrecipients. The kind of organizations or institutions that we think should be part of the consideration of how to move forward with some of these regional challenges. So those are the outcomes that I've sort of gleaned from the prior discussions we've had, but primarily from the written mission statement that the commissioners have given to us, and there's 6 outcomes. So I would open up the floor now for discussion on the outcomes.
Deliverables.
Yeah, outcomes, deliverables. So any comments on any of the outcomes or deliverables we've discussed, or are there any missing? Or do we think that's a good list? All right, well, it looks like it's a pretty good list. So we will move forward. Next slide.
Oh, turn mine on. We're going to have an echo in here. There's more than one speaker on in this room.
But we won't be able to hear them talking unless someone has a speaker at home.
All right.
We can only have one speaker on in this room, right?
Yeah.
Is that you? It could be me.
It's not me. I think I'm muted. Well, I'm not muted, right?
I think you had your speaker on, Robert, do you? Okay.
Okay.
Paul, you have yours on.
Mine's on.
You know, we could hear you really well when it was Paul speaking.
So I'll put mine on.
Well, I've got my mic on now.
Can you hear me, Beth?
Beth, can you hear?
Vera, now you're really clear. Paul's in the background.
I'll put mine on.
Okay.
Hey, Paul,
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
The next issue areas we talked about, so criteria for evaluation. And these are criteria, some of these that we've already discussed, and I think we can move through, but there were also these cross-cutting issues that we wanted to look to. So in anticipation of opening up the portal to some sort of grant program, these are the criteria that I've gleaned from the minutes to date. So the first thing, and this relates to sort of the ARPA mapping project, is a project.
We're referring to this now.
Yeah, or it should, yeah, this relates directly to the spreadsheet that Vera has out. So we want to look for projects that are not funding eligible by other targeted funds from the federal, state, or local ARPA resources. So this is where the Civilytics approach will come in. So, and these would be, this page would be sort of required criteria. The second would be that the project or initiatives has a reasonable size or scope. The third, that objectives are achievable within the scope of the proposal or are otherwise sustainable. So either, the money given for that proposal can complete the process there, or that it sets up something, whatever the project is, to be sustainable long-term. Another one is that it's sort of regionally unique. And I think this probably deserves a little bit of discussion or explanation. But when we're considering housing, for example, if we were to consider homelessness part of that housing problem, addressing sort of homelessness regionally, it's unlikely that any of the towns are going to do that on their own. Also unlikely that the state is going to do anything additional just for the Cape there. So that's a role where the county really could engage in a way that is unique. So I think that's something that we want to look at too, related to not being funding eligible by other targeted resources, but not the same. The next criteria would be that it has measurable outcomes. Whatever the project is, it should have some measurable outcomes. And then the next two, I think, are helpful, and they feed back to the beginning of our presentation discussion here today, that they be consistent with federal ARPA expenditure categories. And final criteria would be that it addresses one or more of the prioritized regional challenges. Parenthetically, that would allow us to prioritize regional challenges and introduce maybe a weighted approach to evaluation of projects that would come in. So those are the criteria that are required. And once again, any comments on the criteria are open for discussion, or anything that we are missing that should be a required criteria. Dan.
Can you hear me? I don't think you can hear me.
I can't hear him.
No, you can't.
I can hear Dan.
Yeah, I think, Dorothy, what happened is they turned their speaker off when they tried to mute. I think everybody muted.
You
So I think Paul, can you hear me yet? Okay, now we can't hear you, but that's okay. Dorothy, you can still hear me, right?
Yeah, and Lisa and Kristen can hear you.
All right, okay.
Sort of
So
like-
the only thing, and
Yeah.
I'm not saying we should, but the only thing we didn't consider is whether or not where the funds are directed is an area that was exacerbated by COVID itself. So that you could argue, for
Yeah.
example, that the housing issue was greatly exacerbated by COVID. But
that's a brilliant idea.
what the wastewater issue wasn't. I'm not necessarily suggesting it, but there is that consideration, which is not, I don't think it's in any of the criteria yet.
Okay, can the people in the room hear Dan?
Yep.
Point? Oh, good, okay.
That's a great point. Yeah. Any other input? Okay, well, let's continue to the next section of criteria. This is where we try to tuck some of these cross-cutting issues that we think would be available if we opened up the portal and we started to accept applications. There are the required criteria, which we just discussed, but then there are other sort of criteria that should be considered, and projects may be given extra points if they address these criteria. So diversity, equity, inclusion, social determinants of health, climate change, access and mobility. We had a conversation about this one with county staff. Transportation issues have come up quite a bit. So if there is a project or a proposal that comes through, we want to make sure that the people that project targets can actually get to those services. So, I think it's an important thing to consider going forward, and leverages additional resources. I think we've talked about that in the couple meetings that we've had. So leveraging additional resources is important, but there might be some projects that still rank high. So those are the criteria that I would suggest for the committee's consideration. Might be ones that are encouraged and then part of an evaluation process. Dan. You can't put your hand down? There you go. Okay. Any discussion on those criteria? So 2 sets of criteria, 1 that would be required, 1 would be encouraged. Kristen?
Just a clarifying question, because you use the word access related to transportation, but access has a broader meaning for me in terms of like affordability. And so are we talking broad access, or is that really about transportation and getting people to where they need to go?
No, I think it's a great point. Thank you for that. We dropped sort of the word transportation because we think it has a broader meaning. And you know, Lisa discussed last time, if we have, say, a behavioral health program, if people don't have access to the internet and can't participate, then that's an access and mobility issue. Dorothy?
It's just a comment. I just think those additional dimensions are so exquisitely good, and they're such cross-cutting considerations. They go right across when you think about housing, public health, et cetera, wastewater. All of it goes across each of those major priority areas. So well done to pulling that together.
Thank you. Lisa? No?
I took my hand down, but now I'm on the spot.
But you want to say something.
I think and maybe this goes a little bit more into the weeds on it, but I think the proof of concept element to projects is really important. And part of this for me is that, you know, maybe some of the projects and opportunities are things that we haven't done here before, but have worked elsewhere, and that we could, you know, not all of our solutions already exist here potentially. So, you know, kind of how just sort of wrapping the proof of concept in some way.
I think that's a good point. Dorothy?
Yeah, I think that is a good point. One of the things I guess I was thinking about too is in terms of our scoring, as it were, if there is a way of giving credit when particular projects address multiple of these criteria. So, I mean, I know that's probably the way the scoring will go, but as an objective, that the goal would be to select those projects that do have fairly broad impact in these targeted areas, that, you know, and again, I'm hoping the scoring will support that.
Yes. Thank you. To Lisa's point, proof of concept, I think that could be included as one of those kind of cross-cutting criteria. I think we could list it there, because I do think evaluating the likelihood of success of any proposal is just, I mean, that's a responsible thing to do. So go ahead.
Relative to proof of concept, Lisa, is this another way of saying that, you know, is within the evidence base? I'm not sure.
Yes.
I'm sure I understand what you mean by proof of concept. Are we intending that the project prove a concept, or that it already be an established way to go about addressing a particular issue?
I'm not sure we want to be so restrictive to have like evidence-based sort of be part of it, but I guess where I'm going with this is like I keep thinking about, you know, maybe some of the best potential projects are not ones that exist here already, and that maybe there, you know, it's working elsewhere. You know, there are projects and programs working elsewhere that we could bring here and localize. That kind of having a proof of concept versus us funding 3 years of a pilot.
Right.
On something.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. If a proposal were to come in and they were to point at a similar proposal, say in San Francisco, that was successful, you know, I think that's a useful thing to consider moving forward. And I think we've all seen grant programs that have been set up that are really well intentioned, but don't achieve the outcome stated because they just haven't thought through it all, or they haven't considered a particular program within the context of the community that they're trying to apply it to. So, and I think that's where that proof of concept.
Like proven concept then, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of like a likelihood of success determination, you know? Karen.
I like
I'm not sure if it's a cross-cutting issue, but I thought I'd raise it anyway, and that's just the notion of wages. And are wages where they need to be to support some of these issues? And what we see in a lot of the COVID funding opportunities in healthcare is that some of those opportunities can go to subsidize wages within hard to recruit areas or whatever the criteria is. Again, I'm not sure if it makes sense, but I thought I'd raise it anyway.
So wages so if it affects wages?
Yeah, or if like one of the cross-cutting, and it sort of is embedded in social determinants and diversity, equity, include.
Yeah,
So
but not
it's sort of
explicitly,
there, but
it's
it
not
doesn't
explicit.
call out wages in relation to our economy in the Cape.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, no, I think that gets to sort of the economic vitality, right, of any of the proposals that come in. So, yeah, I think
I don't know.
let's
So
consider.
wage imbalances,
Dorothy.
One of the things, and this is such a good dialogue, that I guess I'm thinking about is, and Lisa's point made me think about this, which is scalability and replicability are those criteria. But then the other thing is, if they're, I'm not going to phrase this well, but Karen, to your point about wages, for example, is the long-term nature of the intervention something that should be taken into account? Because a lot of the characteristics of the framing of the ARPA money is sort of recovery from the impacts of COVID. But if there is something that's an intervention that is short-lived in nature, if it's not addressing a secular issue on a foundational basis or a structural basis, then it will end when it ends. And so, and I know that, again, this whole issue of the time frame relative to the spending of the money, which is why the revolving loan idea was so appealing, is there. So again, it's really two questions that I have is replicability and scalability. So in other words, as we're looking at them, should they be demonstration projects that would foment other, similar activities? That's number one. Number two is, should the short or long-term nature of it be something that's taken into account?
Yeah, and I think it's a great point, and it's certainly related, and it starts to get into sort of leveraging potentially additional resources and also the sustainability of the programs that come in. I think childcare comes to my mind, thinking about some of these things. I mean, we're paying frontline childcare workers $14 an hour, and we wonder why it's hard to find them, and parents wonder why their rates keep going up, but these frontline workers aren't paid more. If there were a proposal to come in that kind of reorganized childcare in a different way, for example, but it attached a different revenue source that was there in a sustainable way to increase the amount that we pay childcare workers, that would be, that would weigh heavily. I think anything that could create upward pressure on wages that is sustainable long term, I think that's something that we could consider. So I think all of these fit together.
yeah.
They might line up.
Otherwise, they're grants.
Yeah.
They're premium pay and they're grants, which, it seems like through the ARPA criteria, I continue to feel this pressure to sort of treat the money this way, to sort of to get it out and to spend it fast for sort of ARPA Band-Aid type things. Whereas we are trying to drag ourselves toward a more long-term sustainable types of projects that,
yeah.
I wonder how well ARPA itself is structured to do what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think that was the discussion we had earlier with CLA.
Right.
Because this is a once in a lifetime expenditure of funds by the federal government for most of us, I would imagine. And so there's the opportunity, given the scope and the amount of money that's available, to do things that are transformative in nature. But if we're treating it like it's a shovel-ready federal response to a recession, then we're going to wind up wasting a lot of money. So
Can I ask
that's a good point. Sure.
So Karen, relative to your comment about wages and how to sort of involve ARPA funding in successfully rescaling wages upward, how do you think that through? How would that work? You know, beyond the ARPA money, which we can't spend on wages, we find out, beyond 24.
Yeah, well, I mean, it gets to the heart of sort of what we're trying to do. An investment in wages helps childcare workers.
Right.
Yeah.
And then helps them grow the business and be sustainable through rates or otherwise.
But how does it help them be sustainable? So let's say we scale wages up between now and
Yeah.
December 31st of 24. That's cool.
Yeah.
Then what?
Well, I mean, again, it's the business. So, you know, restaurants are probably not a great example of this. But and I don't want to necessarily go to healthcare, but healthcare would be a good
Right.
example
Yeah.
because getting those wages to a certain level, then it does sustain operations and does sustain other things. I think childcare is another good example because sources of revenue over time can increase if the business thrives. I'm sure there are other examples that I'm not thinking of right now. But it's really investing in businesses that have the ability to thrive and are starting from a reasonable place.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I could see on childcare potentially a regional coalition of childcare providers that came together and requested ARPA funds to make a structural change
Yeah.
or realignment. Or to buy like a food truck, for example, that would be able to deliver hot food for the Head Start program, something like that. But as part of that, to increase the likelihood that they would be funded, they might agree to raise the lowest wage that they have for childcare workers. So I can see where it could provide an incentive for people to look at wages. I could also see some structural changes, even on the food insecurity side. You know, there are a lot of smaller food bank programs, but if they were knit together, if there were a regional coalition, but it were tied to paying some of their employees more, that would be something we could look at. And I do think there are certain industry clusters that might also be able to request something that was structural in nature, that would change things, right? They would spend the money to change the structure of how this industry works on the Cape. And in response to that, either because of out of efficiencies or whatever, that those efficiencies, any efficiencies derived would be directed towards increased wages. So I think it can work. But we'll see. Lisa, you're
I
muted.
think this is like such an important thing that Karen brought up, both in the question of wages, but more broadly around, you know, this is a short period of time, a high influx of cash. Like really the question for me is like, what's the return on the investment?
Right.
That's the question, right? It's sustainability, it's retention of, you know, whatever the measure is. And I'm, as somebody who writes grants and proposals, I'm really trying not to make this so, we have to be really thoughtful to not make it so arduous that people are like, forget it, it's not worth the money. But I do think that the question is such a good one because it's there's such a finite amount of time. You know, what's the return on the, you know, what is the return on the investment of this project? And, you know, there has to be, that's part of the measure, it's part of the impact, right? So, but I think thinking about that, you know, economics, you know, retention of, you know, residents, and we can just, I just think that that's really the question that it comes back to.
Well said. Well said. Okay. Any other discussion on criteria? And again, if we will make this PowerPoint available to the public and we'll send it all out to you. And if there are additional comments that maybe you didn't get a chance to suggest today, we'll have space in the next meeting to consider that. So I think we can move to the next slide. So this gets, the next slide considers how are we going to do all of these, how are we going to deliver all of these deliverables and meet the outcomes. Given that there's it's kind of mixed. And so one of the things that come up and I think might help us think about how criteria would be applied and how we might suggest some regional projects of a regional benefit would be if we made recommendations to the commissioners that maybe there's 3 grant programs, a small grants program, and this is all up for discussion, but if there were a small grants program that provided, say, a minimum of 10, maximum of $20,000 through the portal, a large grant program that maybe had a minimum of 250, a maximum of 500,000, it would still leave enough, I think, to look at 2 of these regional kind of mega grants that could be from $5 to $10 million. So I think on the mega grant side, that's where I think this committee would have to look for these projects of regional impact and make some suggestions based on our prioritization of the regional challenges. But the large grant program, if we had 5 or 6 of these grants out there, that could have a meaningful impact moving forward. Even if you look at sort of broadband initiatives, and we wanted to look at sort of municipal efforts to organize sort of municipal utility around broadband, some of these grants could be available at challenge for that purpose, which I think is a step forward. And the ability with a fairly small percentage of this money to put 50 or 100 grants on the ground out there regionally in the $10,000 to $20,000 range would be significant. I think it sort of broadens our reach. It broadens the number of people that are going to benefit from this program. I think it invites, if we open up the portal for different kinds of programs, it invites a kind of ingenuity that maybe we aren't considering as a committee. We might get some great ideas that we didn't think about that came in there. But it also allows us on the top side, with the mega grants, to really look at these regional challenges and maybe suggest ways forward to maybe the top 2 priorities, regional challenges that we come up with as priorities. And this is where I think, we might fence off some of the money as these larger grants sort of develop based on recommendations we make to the commissioners. The other advantage here is this is where an iterative approach of giving recommendations back to the commissioners before we complete all of our work on a small grants or a large grants program gets money on the street right now. So this helped me think about how we could meet all of the objectives that have been outlined for us by the commissioners with, I think it's going to take more than one program. So I would put that up for consideration. Sean.
Thank you. I like this approach actually, but it does make me wonder. So, immediately, because, different ideas in my head, and then you try to add up different things. And then considering the amount of money that we've got to work with, it makes me wonder 2 things. One, if you're thinking about in terms of sort of in each of these categories, a ballpark of how many grants that would entail. Because I feel like with the money that we have, a mega grant, there's probably, maybe you can get 1 or 2, maybe. And then also in this approach, I think that, or I'm wondering, let me put it in the form of a question. With each of those grants, is there sort of a different, with each level, is there a sort of, not different criteria, but I don't know how to say it, but that sort of, because I feel like, obviously the criteria for the mega grant, for example, I'm sure we'll have this expectation that, well, man, this better be really worth it.
Right.
So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there.
No, I think that is good input. And I mean, different programs could have different criteria. We might lighten up the criteria on the small grant side to make it easier for people to apply and get some money out there. But this is all up to you. And as it relates to the number of grants, it's really not the purview of this committee to recommend to the commissioners. Well, I guess it's up to you. I guess we could, but 10 million's already been made available to the towns of the 41 million. Whether there's an additional amount that's made available to the towns, I think remains a discussion on the county level. So this anticipates, there could be, under these scenario, minimum of 50 grants, maximum of 100, potentially under a small grants program, 3 to 6, on the large grant program, and 1 or 2 mega projects. And so it allows us that flexibility and tries to avoid us getting swept up into any discussions about municipal use. But one of the things that this approach could do is towns could be one of those subrecipients that we identify, even if it's just for one of the 3 programs. And that might be a better and more directed way to fund the towns with the ARPA funds. So that's up for discussion. I see Kristen has her hand up.
Thanks. I'm a little conflicted because I definitely agree that there should be some guidelines and parameters to help with the decision making. And I also feel like when you limit or you sort of put these ideas in buckets, it will limit the creativity. It will limit the opportunity for the applicants as well as for those that are responsible for making the decisions. And I've seen enough grant applications in my 17 years at the foundation to know that people get creative with their budgeting. And so they'll either over budget or under budget and smush things into a program to make it fit the parameters. So I just would caution us to really think about that. And, maybe it's more sort of an internal guideline than, externally saying like, these are the buckets that things would be in. I just wouldn't want to limit the opportunity here.
I think that's a great point, Kristen. And any, given your experience, any recommendations you would have on how we might adjust criteria or the evaluation process to ensure that doesn't happen, or, how we sort of categorize things is definitely, please make some suggestions. Lisa. You're muted.
When will I learn? Muted. Much aligned with Kristen. I do think with the amount of money we're talking about here, I think, we should be encouraging projects to think about 75,000 as like, spent over 3 years as the small grants. As an individual or with others, I think, 10 to 20,000, it just doesn't go very far for projects and organizations, even if it's a one-time purchase. So I think just kind of opening things up a little bit, allowing, we've got what, 20 through 26, right? The funds to be spent. Yes. So it could be spent in 1 year, spent in multiple years, up to, just feels like it's a ton of work to write a grant for $10,000. It's just what it comes down to,
So, and this is great feedback. So, and this is where I think we rely on members of the committee that write a lot of grant applications and members of the committee that review a lot of grant applications. What is the right spending amount? I mean, initially I had just considered maybe even smaller grants to spread it around, but the accountability and the administration costs associated with a bunch of small grants has to factor in to our consideration. And the amount of money that we have would allow a small grants program that maybe isn't that small. So yeah, 75,000. That makes sense to me. And maybe there's 2 grant programs instead of 3 grant programs. But this is part of what I think we need to consider. But I do think at least having 2 programs, if not 3, allows us to meet both of those deliverables about identifying regionally significant projects and working some around that, because I don't think we're likely to get those suggestions if we just open up the portal. But then how can we push the criteria out there and encourage people to apply with sort of creative and innovative responses and make a meaningful impact and not have it cost an organization more to write the grant than they're going to get in return, and not make Beth crazy and administrate these things. So
Yeah, I was just going to say, I really appreciate this. You know, what's the scale of the program? So I think the more feedback we get around this will be really helpful.
Yeah, it will be. And this is just for discussion purposes. So Sean, do you have, oh, no, hands up. Okay. So, I think Wendy.
Hi, my camera's not working, which is okay with me, but two thoughts. First, the large regionally significant impact. I worry that that's going to get diluted if we only have $10 million, but that's one comment. My bigger comment is the state of Massachusetts, the legislature consistently earmarked the state budget for special projects in cities and towns. And all of that rolled down to the Mass Office of Travel and Tourism to manage those grants, which I would continually push back and say, you've turned our state marketing office into the grants management office. So I just caution that if we're going to do a grants program of a significant number of grants, that there's infrastructure there at the county for the grant review, the management, the oversight, and reporting, because that's a lot of work too.
Absolutely well said. And it is a lot of work. There are some funds available, and the committee could make recommendations to the commissioner that a certain percentage of the funds be used to staff up and support a grants program. Kristen.
So just a question. I know we're stewarding some of the CDBG funds, and there's a lot of strings attached to that and typical CDBG. But as I understand, the ARPA funds, Beth, aren't as restrictive in terms of like required reporting. Is that dictated by the process, or do you have certain mandates? Because I'm thinking that obviously ties into the size of the grants as well, right? So just the administrative side for the county, and also the administrative work required on behalf of the grantees as well. So is there like a standard set of reporting requirements for this funding, or are you setting that?
I can turn.
Yeah, there is. I mean, yes, there is. We are required to do quarterly reporting. And then there are different requirements for, depending on what bucket of money the funds are being spent from, whether they're reimbursement or grants. So right now, the approach we're taking, and we're going to leave it open to see how it goes, is we're going to make a decision on each application, whether it's a reimbursable or whether it's a grant fund that needs to be reported on. So the size of these does matter as far as the amount of staffing we're going to need to monitor. That's why I'm very interested in the feedback from you and Lisa in particular, and Wendy, around what's the right size and what that's going to mean for the county administrative support.
Great point. And so I would just suggest as a sort of a way to move forward that we have given this a little bit more thought on how we might apply and how a weighted system might work. I think we should have that discussion at our next meeting, but would take any sort of suggestions on amounts and approaches prior to that, so that maybe we can take this piece and give back to the committee something that's a little bit more fully formed, that we might be able to drive some consensus about. But thinking about, because we can take individual suggestions by email, but we cannot email each other as a group. That would be a violation of the open meeting law. So we will either structure another open discussion on this, and you all can think about it. We can come back next week. And then at that point, I think Vera could step through some of the suggestions about how a weighted criteria process would be evaluated. Dorothy.
And it's so good to have Kristen and Lisa and Wendy here, talking directly from experience. And obviously our experience at the bank is philanthropic in nature, but And we have ample staff to handle it, and it covers a lot of things. And basically, Paul, we've structured it in fairly similar to what you've identified, with segmenting it that way. But I guess, and this may be not a good question, but as you talk about staffing to support the administration of programs associated with a time-delimited program, I guess I go back to, are you building a structure for something that is, time constrained in nature? And so as I think about subrecipients, is it possible that in some form or structure, whether it is by priority area or something like that, does it make sense to even consider the fact that a subrecipient could be tasked, just as Kristen and the Cape Cod Foundation are tasked with CDBG, to actually manage elements of a smaller program, making the administrative undertaking more manageable. That's just what was striking me.
Okay. I think that has sort of come up in a conversation with Beth and Vera. It might be that we could recommend that some of the money be used to support another organization that already administers grants, and that could administer certain aspects or certain grant programs that we might suggest. So that's a comment that is well said, and we're going to take that into consideration. Dan.
Yeah, Paul, I'm not sure whether it's captured by sort of the criteria that we set up and discussed earlier, but I do think there's something to be said for really understanding the difference between a lasting grant and something that has a shorter impact, or, so a capital expenditure versus operating money. And if I could just give an example of it, if we're talking about, let's say, a daycare facility, childcare facility, it's very different if what we're doing is subsidizing the income of those workers. And God knows they are underpaid, and we have to address that. But versus either bringing a facility up to code so that they can actually provide the service, or a bus or some kind of capital expenditure that will allow them to expand or be in business in the first place. And because this is a one-time limited, as much as, remember, sponsor of increasing minimum wage, I'm not talking about cutting the wages out. We have to address that. But I do think there's something to be said for looking at grants and projects that will either enable or seed something that can continue, or allow an existing program to expand or improve. And I don't know whether that's captured or not in the criteria, but certainly I would hope we would look at that.
Yes, good point. Kristen.
Sorry, I think I just forgot to put my hand down. Sorry.
Okay. Lisa.
Yes, and Dan, did I say that right? Those capital dollars are easier to get than ongoing program dollars elsewhere. I'm just going to say it out loud. And the example of the bus is a good one, because you buy the bus and then who drives the bus?
Right.
And that's just like the ongoing challenges of organizations and, funder restrictions. So I just say, that's why I kind of like this idea of it can be spent on a capital, it could be spent over 3 years, it could be a one-time expense. In your smaller grants, your other, there should be as much flexibility and enough money in there to be spent over a few years to be able to give a project a shot to figure out its pathway of sustainability over time, or make that purchase and move on.
Yeah. Well said. This has been a great discussion. Anything more? So I think there is some consensus on the committee that we look at maybe a multi-programmed approach that allows us to meet the mission that we have. So we'll fine tune that a little bit and come back to you with a more specific suggestion for your consideration in 2 weeks. Having said that, we'll move on to the final slide. I hope the final slide. Yes, so this is a discussion of just sort of the schedule. Thinking that we're going to meet every 2 weeks, if we were to run this out through July 28th, and how we might schedule the meetings. Today is the 19th, so this original schedule is probably not going to work. But what I thought we might do is leave the first 20 minutes of the meeting for these discussions with Civilytics that are helping us, finalize that sort of ARPA map of resources. Would be a good way to start. But then, we have 6 regional challenges to consider, and I do think we need to get into a substantive discussion of each. And I think allowing 40 minutes for each one and trying to do 2 at a meeting, I think is probably a good way to do that. And then I think it would inform us in sort of prioritizing those challenges at the end of June. We talked about outcomes and criteria today, so that'll be sort of a continuing piece of this meeting that we would develop going forward. And I think, we based on the discussion today, we could pretty quickly get to the point where we are making some of these iterative recommendations to the commissioners that would encourage them to put some money on the street. So dealing with Civilytics and where all the ARPA money has gone, dealing with 2 regional challenges in a substantive way, 40 minutes each, and then our ability to prioritize those regional challenges, and then I think also identifying the types of subrecipients, probably a discussion that would come after a little bit of the regional challenge discussions. And then I think we can begin after we're through each of the 6 regional challenge areas, this discussion of potential projects of regional impact. I think some of that will bubble up in the discussions as we get into each of these subject matter areas. But this is my suggestion on how we might, as a committee, move as quickly but as responsibly as we can through the process. If we overlay a multi-grant program on top of this, I think that gives us a little breathing room on the larger potential expenditures, but allows us to get some of these other grant programs maybe on the street sooner rather than later. So I would suggest that as maybe a schedule going forward. We all can count, so you can see that these anticipate maybe 2-hour meetings rather than 90-minute meetings. But I think it will be difficult to move through. Give us enough of the subject matter review and discussion to be able to meet our outcomes of prioritizing regional challenges, identifying subrecipients, and looking for projects that have a regional impact. So that would be my suggestion. Any feedback on the schedule? Great. All right, so that looks good. So having been through that discussion, that's the end of the PowerPoint. I do think the visuals were helpful. We're at 12:20 of what was anticipated to be a 90-minute meeting that would end at 12:30, although we did start late with technical difficulties. What I'd like to do is maybe suggest that we push the discussion of regional challenges and begin that in 2 weeks, and beginning with housing and water quality up front. And with the help, I believe, of the Cape Cod Commission, will have some information for you to review, like a 1 or 2 page sort of highlighted discussion or outline of the problem for us to consider. And we can begin that in 2 weeks. Christy has turned on her camera, probably tell me no. No, okay, all right, good, good. So that sounds good. I think that would bring us to the end of the agenda today, but I do feel like we've made some progress, some significant progress today. Is there anything that any member of the committee would want to add at this point in the process in the meeting? Lisa.
So can someone outline the proper communication regarding outside of meetings, how that's supposed to roll? And then also just a general question. I'm not sure if we've talked about this. Are there any restrictions on who could apply for funds?
We haven't discussed that yet. Do you mean with regard to the legislation?
Yes.
I don't have it committed to memory chapter and verse, but I don't believe so.
But that's a good question, Lisa.
Yeah,
It's up to us to winnow that. Beth?
Paul, Paul and Vera, I mean, just to respond to Lisa's question, I think we should have CLA staff attend each of these meetings.
Yeah.
So these are the consultants that we've hired. They've been on board. They are our ARPA experts. So when these really specific questions come up, I'd like them to be here to respond to them. And so I just wanted to make that suggestion that we make sure we give them the schedule and add them.
Yeah.
And then as far as communication, just so as we don't violate any open meeting law, if you have specific feedback, I would email Paul as the chair, and you can copy Vera and I, or just send it to all three of us.
But remember, just those three people.
Yes, just
No,
those
no
three
other
people.
members of the committee. We have a committee with, as it stands now, 7 voting members, so there can't be a voting quorum discussion. So no 4 of you should have lunch and discuss this at all, ever. So that's how we
What
can
if
move.
we don't have lunch?
No discussion. You can actually eat lunch as long as you quietly sort of contemplate your food and don't speak.
I guess the dinner party with Ron Beatty is off then, huh?
Yes, it is.
Oh, it's a public meeting. I do have one other question.
Yes, Dan.
You know, and I know that there's not a lot we can do about this, but I do think we should voice it. My concern ongoing, this is a high horsepower group we've got here. We've got this great intellect. We've got great resources. Your leadership, exemplary as always. My concern about this is it's a check the box exercise with the people who are ultimately going to be spending the money. And I don't know what we do about that, but there's absolutely no understanding or commitment from the people who are going to be making the final decisions that this, you know, that this weights in on their decision at all. So that is my concern. I looked at the process prior to us coming together, and I am concerned that, you know, this is a formality without a whole lot of, you know, without anything behind it. So I'm just going to voice that because I have been on other groups like selection committees and stuff that end up not being listened to. And there's a hell of a lot of brain horsepower that's going into this work.
Yeah, noted. Because
is there anybody from the commission that's even going to come to these meetings, for example? I mean, are we going to have, I mean, I know that we do have an interface now, but is there going to be any engagement prior to us giving them recommendations that would give us a peace of mind that we have a place at the table?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think we might be, part of this, we might be better off just sort of on our own without sort of the influence of the commissioners, but I do understand what you're saying, Dan. And so I do think as we get towards the end of this and we start to open this up for public comment, that might be an appropriate time to invite the commissioners in, especially once we get some more details and we're ready to give some more specific feedback. So that is a good point.
Paul, is this group that is putting together sort of the foundation of this, is this group going to be involved at all in evaluating and looking at grants?
That remains to be seen. It is one thing that the commissioners discussed. Like once we give recommendations back, it could be that they ask members of the committee for a phase 2 approach where you apply the criteria to grants that come in.
But they could be discussing that process now so that there is an established process in place.
Yeah.
That makes it look like this will be part of that process. That's
They could. And this is where I think some of the iterative recommendations may benefit us, because if the first recommendations we give back to the commissioners are structural in nature about the program, like, you know, a multi-grant program and some criteria and evaluation, I think it's easier for them to contemplate who should be evaluating the grant applications that come in, the application for funds. So I hear you. I agree. And so the commissioners should be engaged with the committee at an appropriate time. And so when we think we're ready to do that, we will extend that invitation. I will say, I think the commissioners are really waiting. I think they see the value in this committee. And it is also, I would just point out, very difficult for the 3 commissioners to have substantive conversations. They can really only do it in the confines of the public meeting. And given the magnitude of the issue in front of us, those are difficult discussions to have. So I think they're sort of relying on us to have those discussions and then be able to present them back to the commissioners in a way where they can adequately discuss and consider our recommendations in a public meeting, given the sort of structural difficulties that they have. So that's a good point. And I would also say, I think the recommendation of CLA here is a great one. So as questions come up during the meeting, we can sort of then forward those questions to CLA. They can report back at the next meeting on that. And if they can hang on the call, they could be available for questions as they come up. So we'll take that also as a recommendation and figure that into the schedule. Lisa? No? Okay. All right. Well, this has been a good discussion. Is there anything else that anyone has to say? Seeing no other other input, I would take a motion to adjourn. We will have a roll call vote on that motion after it's made and seconded.
So moved.
Been
Second.
moved, Dan, second by Dorothy. Karen Gardner.
Aye.
Sean Gonzalez.
Aye.
Lisa Guyon.
Aye.
Wendy Northcross.
Aye.
Kristen O'Malley.
Aye.
Dorothy Savarese.
Aye.
Dan Wolf.
Aye.
Thank you all so very much. We will be in touch. And send any suggestions along you have that are based on today's sort of discussion. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for your leadership.
Thank you. Bye-bye.